and has sponsored Dr. Trin's talk today, which is the third talk in our diversity series. So I'm going to hand off to Dr. Han.
Thank you so much. For those who don't know me, like Dr. Forrester said, I'm a first-year psychiatry fellow. My name is Crystal Han. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Trin, who has graciously accepted to speak on such an important topic as part of our diversity series and as part of my APA SAMHSA Minority Fellowship. Dr. Nhi-Ha Trinh serves as the director for the Department of Psychiatry Center for Diversity at Massachusetts General Hospital. She also serves as residency training mentor for the Mass General McLean Adult Psychiatry Training Program and has been the course director for the residency's longitudinal sociocultural psychiatry didactic series for more than a decade. She also teaches, advises, and mentors Harvard Medical School students as the associate director of the HMS Home Society. Dr. Trin's academic focus focuses on disparities in depression care for ethnic and racial minorities, issues of cultural sensitivity and mental health, and improving care for diverse adult and geriatric psychiatric patients. She's also served as co-editor for 4 published books on various topics, including Asian American psychiatry, racism in psychiatry, sociocultural issues in psychiatry, and diversity and cultural sensitivity in mental health. Dr. Trin earned her undergraduate degree at Harvard College, her medical degree at UC San Francisco, her Master of Public Health at UC Berkeley, completed residency training in adult psychiatry at Mass General McLean, and a clinical fellowship in geriatric psychiatry at McLean. So thank you so much, Dr. Trin, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for that really kind introduction. And please call me Nhi-Ha. Dr. Trin, as if we were seeing patients together. I appreciate the use of titles, especially being a woman in medicine, and I'm always Nhi-Ha, not Dr. Trin, but we're all colleagues here today. I really appreciate and value this invitation. I'm curious about the other lectures that you've had in this series, and so I'm sure in the Q&A time I can hear a little bit about what's on your minds in Maryland and Baltimore, and sort of think about together how we can all move this work forward, no matter where we are. So we're in a virtual format. It is, I don't know what the weather is like in Baltimore, but I'm looking outside my window. It is snowing, and I was thinking to myself, you know, it was a blizzard last night, and if I had tried to travel in this kind of weather, I probably wouldn't have made it. So maybe that's the only silver lining I can see from this pandemic, is that I can be here with you without any travel delay in our virtual world. So I know that we have until 1:30. I hope to use maybe about 55 minutes of the first hour to share with you my prepared remarks and then leave the forum open for questions. I'm sure Crystal and others will be able to take a look at the Q&A, and certainly feel free to, I won't be monitoring the chat during my talk just because I'm a little old school. I can't multitask as well in that way. But I promise I'm happy to engage with you all, and that's much more fun for me to sort of hear about what you all are thinking and to sort of challenge my thinking as well. As I've been giving talks through the years, I learn a lot from my participants as well. So in terms of financial disclosures, I do want to let you know that I did receive some royalties as a book editor through Oxford University Press, and my spouse did through Oxstone Publishing. And the other disclosure relates to what we'll be talking about today, which is that some of this material for us, each of us, may touch us in different ways. It may touch our blind spots, I would say, and sometimes our soft spots, you know, things that might hurt inside from our own personal experiences and lived experiences. So I would just encourage us to be mindful that we're all, myself included, coming with the best intentions to learn from each other, and then to be respectful of all our different perspectives as well. All right. So in terms of course objectives, at the end of this presentation, I hope you will be able to, you know, review and define what are mental health disparities versus mental health inequities. Define the terms of racism and anti-racism, both of which are very important concepts and constructs that we've been talking about in our nation in 2020. to compare and contrast the concepts of cultural competence. I'm dating myself because when I was a resident and fellow, cultural competence was all the rage, right? And clearly that is now outdated, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And a movement toward, in our field, as well as other mental health professions, toward cultural humility. I'll also give to the clinicians in the audience, because you all will think, okay, this is great, Nhi-Ha, you know, you're talking about all these concepts and social constructs, but what about what I can do in my clinical practice? And so I'll touch on some of the tools that we can use in the DSM-5, very practical. I'm a little bit of a practical clinician. I just came out from my virtual clinic to join you all today. And then for each of you at the end, to reflect on how each of you can identify 3 ways in your own lives that you might be able to incorporate a cultural humility framework and an anti-racist approach to your clinical practice, to the way you educate each other in your workplace environment. All right, we'll do that all within an hour. Sound good? Ready? Okay, here we go. All right, got a thumbs up from Crystal, so we're good. All right, also Heather, thank you for the thumbs ups. So in terms of this outline, I will say that it is thanks to our former First Lady, Michelle Obama, one of the best books I think I've read in my life, her volume Becoming. She reads it in audiobook, so if you're someone who is a multitasker, I definitely encourage you to pick it up and enjoy it. And she sort of divides her book into sort of 3 parts, right? And she talks about herself, her personal background, coming from the I. And I think that each of us in our fields as clinicians, as educators, as researchers, no matter as administrators, as staff, no matter where you are in your department, where you are in your setting, should always come from the I, sort of a little bit of you know, reflection, self-reflection about who you are and where you're coming from. And then Michelle Obama talks about progressing to we, right? And so she talks there about her adult life. Here, I'd like us to think about we as in how do we bring together and think about anti-racist frameworks, and then also cultural humility frameworks, right? Like those, to me, I think of anti-racism. I got this question recently. What do you think is the difference, compare and contrast? I think about anti-racism as sort of a philosophy. And it's not just about anti-racism, it's really about anti-oppression. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And sort of in our day-to-day interactions and our way of approaching problems, taking a culturally humble approach. Ultimately, we want to become us, right? It's not I versus you, us versus them, it's about us. So how do we build a culturally humble and anti-racist framework in our workplace, in our clinics, in our cultures, in our workplace cultures? All right, so if we weren't in this funny WebEx format where I can't really see you all and I'm sitting here talking in my little home office, you know, I would say what like a Rorschach test, like what does this image conjure up for you, right? And people would call out. Most people say, oh, it looks really luxurious or blingy, or oh, this is a flashback from the 80s. Look at that 2-tone watch. Oh my goodness. And one of my residents said, oh, whoever was wearing that watch, they really have like a granny style. I mean, look at that blouse. It looks so old fashioned. And I started chuckling because this is my blouse, actually. This is my father's watch. So I was like, okay, I get it. But I'm sharing this image with you because it tells you, it's an image that tells you a lot about who I am. I'm actually a Vietnamese person. You can likely tell from my last name if you are acquainted with those last names. My family came from Vietnam around the fall of Saigon, so 1975. I was 1 year old at the time. And, you know, we definitely had that quintessential immigrant refugee experience coming to the US. And so we struggled a lot. You know, my parents struggled a lot to provide for their families. My dad at the time was not an international medical graduate. He was a foreign medical graduate, right? And so there was some connotation and stigma to that in the 70s. And he worked really hard, right? And they really tried to build a life for themselves here, right? And so through that struggle, you know, he finally passed the TOEFL exam and the boards and became a psychiatrist himself. If he saved enough money, what did he do? He went out and True Asian dad, he bought himself a Rolex. Ah, I've made it, he said. The funny thing is, he passed away, but at the time he had a really thick Vietnamese accent, so he would call it, bought myself a Rolex, right? So this was the Rolex, right? And we're also part of a patriarchal society and culture, so he didn't give this Rolex to me before he died. He gave it to my son, right? Okay, pass over a generation. Well, he doesn't know. I like to wear it from time to time. So this is me. This is part of my family story, is sort of this story and history of struggle. And at the same time, as I've gotten older, not only have I appreciated some of the minority status and the disadvantage I've had in my life, I've actually come to appreciate a lot of the advantage that I've had in my life, right? And so, yes, I would identify myself as BIPOC. However, unlike my Latinx or Black colleagues and friends, I can pass in certain situations that they cannot, right? I can be afforded access to spaces that they cannot. I also realized that even though my parents came with quote unquote nothing, they had education. And so they were able to build up into the middle class and generate wealth in their family. And it was an intact family, right? So we were able to help each other out. The reason why I share this with you all is because as you're reflecting and as you're self-reflecting, I want you all to start thinking about the various aspects of your identity, right? Your cultural identity. Crystal mentioned that I teach the residents, and we have a longitudinal series where we talk about sociocultural issues. And in the first year, in that intern year, we really focus on the I, right? And so we ask residents and interns to reflect on their growing up and their personal backgrounds, and thus how that might interact and intersect with their patients. What's interesting is that we do this this exercise. It's developed by Pamela Hayes, and if you're interested in this kind of description and dialogue, I suggest you check out her book. It's very rich in thinking about cultural identity in a multi-dimensional way. And she talks about not more than what meets the eye, right? And so not just the acquired wealth and the fancy watch, but really what's beyond that, right? What's going on in the inside of for each of us. And she also maintains that, in something that we all have started to think about, is that some of us have areas of relative minority status, minority meaning having less power, or not being the default in society, versus relative areas of dominant or majority status. And I bet you if you went through all these categories and you identified for each of you where you might fit into a quote unquote minority group versus a dominant group, you would probably find that, as I did, that the areas where I identified as being as part of the dominant or default or majority group in this country, I hadn't really thought about, right? Because people point out to me all the time, hey, you look a little Asian. Hey, you're a woman, right? So I'm very comfortable with that part of my status because, it's been pointed out to me. I've had to work through it. But I had forgotten, I'm straight. I'm middle to upper class. I don't have any disabilities. And so these areas of relative dominance or dominant status, I had not reflected on, and I needed to be able to do this work. And I encourage you each to do as well. Now, I put up here intersectionality. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term to talk about how some of these overlapping minority status can cause double disadvantage, triple disadvantage, challenges, depending on who you are. So I talked about the fact that I'm both a woman as well as a Vietnamese woman, right? So there are certain challenges that I might face for both of those identities, right? And we will see that as well in our colleagues, our patients, and our friends. Sound good? Okay, moving on. How do we progress to we, right? So I don't want this to be all about the navel gazing, right? I did come from Ivy League school, and we're definitely guilty of navel gazing, right? We definitely have to look within, but then we need to look out, right? And we need to think about how can we, each of us, come together to become we. Well, closer to home, we had a very big high definition mirror put up to us in Boston I guess it was 2018 now. Gosh, that feels like so long ago. Where the Boston Globe, the Spotlight series, it's an investigative team that goes into depth on certain issues. They published this scathing series about Boston and the legacy of racism in Boston, right? And I have lots of friends. I originally grew up in the South. I think I might have neglected to say that. I grew up in Louisiana, first in a small town and then in New Orleans. And there's a different brand of racism there, for sure. I have some friends from Texas and Georgia. They talked about how when they moved up to the Northeast, people would say, ooh, you know, Boston, that's really racist. I mean, that's a lot saying if you come from the South, and people are saying that, right? It's a different kind of brand, I would say, flavor of the challenges of racism. The positive through all of this was that it brought to light some of the structural, the institutional, the social challenges that people face in Boston. For instance, one of the highly quoted statistics and debated during that was this quotation that, you know, in the Boston area, for families, white families in the Boston area, their wealth was the median net worth. So, you know, worth minus debts was close to, you know, $250,000. For Black families, 8. So sometimes if I'm doing a workshop with people in Boston, I'll quiz them and say, well, you know, what's the right answer here? And people will say, no, that can't be. That's a typo. How can that be? But, you know, and people wrote into the editor of the Boston Globe, how can that be? Did you guys make a typo? But I think it shed light, just as we all need to shed light on the disparities, the inequities that we see. More on that in a minute. And it also shed light on some of the challenges that we have in our own hospital institutions, namely Mass General. This was quite, you know, inflammatory at the time. Now I'm kind of like, no, it's like, okay, we're moved forward. But at the time, it brought to light what I would say some populations and communities said, yeah, we knew that. Other people were quite abashed. They were like, oh my gosh, how could that be? But like anything, for us to have change, we need to see the problems. And so from this series, and I'll talk about more what's going on in our department, our institution, but from this series, our hospital finally established Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, Dr. Joe Betancourt, and finally put hard money to thinking about dismantling structural racism. So again, sometimes we do need that mirror, right? For ourselves, for our communities, for our institutions, for real change. All right, so I've mentioned this term disparities, right? And in my prior life, before I was a clinician educator, I was a disparities researcher. I remember when this came out at the time, almost 20 years ago, it was really groundbreaking. The Institutes of Medicine, they talked about this idea of unequal treatment, confronting racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare. This was groundbreaking, revolutionary. And they talked about this idea of disparities being differences in healthcare services received by two groups, not due to differences in their healthcare needs or preferences of the members. So what is this difference made of? If you've ever been to like a health services conference or really geeked out on disparities, you will find this particular diagram, right? And this is the way they try to characterize what these disparities might be due to. So here's the difference between non-minority and minority groups in the quality of healthcare. And they broke it down. They said, okay, well, maybe if a need is there for a particular population or preference, that's okay. But, and this is pre-Affordable Care Act, but if it's about the healthcare system, access to health insurance, the regulatory climate of that community, or provider discrimination. What are our biases as providers? What's the stereotyping that we may be engaging in? And is there clinical uncertainty there because of our own challenges connecting with our patients? And they said that was not appropriate. That is a disparity. So since then, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the HRQ, has been reporting on national health quality and disparities, right? And, you know, in the PDF age, luckily you can get this as a PDF. It is like a very weighty tome. It is like 300 pages of facts and figures that they put together from multiple national sources, tracking disparities for almost the last 20 years. So here's just to give you a sense of the kind of quality measures they're looking at and the different domains of healthcare that are covered, right? They track 8 different clinical conditions, and you'll be pleased to see they look at mental health and substance use disorders. And I could spend the rest of the meeting talking about specific disparities, but I would just bore you because it would be the same thing. The evidence is overwhelming, right? And so this is just a snapshot over time of how disparities are improving or not improving for BIPOC, and I use this term, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, for those communities, as compared to white populations. Mostly getting worse, some the same, very few getting better. I was really privileged to be a part of this group with Cambridge Health Alliance, where we looked at the cusp of the Affordable Care Act, trends in racial ethnic disparities in access to mental health care. And we looked at a national sample and found that over time, even with increased interest and visibility about healthcare disparities and a lot of effort and time and funding, that we weren't making a lot of, sort of headway in those disparities. So as a result, unfortunately, for mental health disorders, that leads to greater persistence, severity, and disease burden in these mental health disorders among racial and ethnic minorities, right? That's dismal, it's challenging. Now, recently, I had the honor of hearing my distinguished colleague, Ruth Shim, speak. She just published a book regarding health inequities, mental health inequities and justice and injustice. And she challenged us to think beyond disparities, right? Because disparities really track healthcare outcomes, right? And oftentimes, in her opinion and the way she thinks about these things, they put too much focus on the individual clinician, right? In our clinical bias or our stereotyping of patients, in the patients, whether or not they're accessing healthcare or not, and what's the stigma around that, right? She challenged us to look a little bit in a broader view, to thinking about inequity. And the reason why she wants us to do that is that we really need to look at the systems, right? To think about the larger context, the social context that then funnels down to the mental health challenges we see in our patients. And this is a very busy slide, but if you're able to check out Dr. Shim's review article in Focus about social determinants of mental health, that's what she's talking about. She's saying it's everything, right? And we see that when we take care of patients, that people's housing status, their opportunities, their educational status, the neighborhoods in which they live really impact their mental health. So what can we do to reduce inequities, right? So on one hand, we sort of started from the I, then we went really big and started thinking about some of the societal injustice, right? But how can we each approach this every day? Well, I'd like to challenge us to think about our mission statements in our academic institutions. And, most of academic institutions really think about not just clinical practice, but also educating trainees, fellows, and also faculty development. They think about conducting research and advocacy on behalf of the communities that they serve, right? And ultimately, my colleague, Dr. Shim, myself, and others really think about this as not just a question of equality, not even a question of equity, but ultimately justice, right? So how do we fix those problems, both on a macro level, as well as I'll talk about on a micro level. So this would be another one. If we were in an auditorium, I'd say, hey guys, how many of you guys have read this book? And many of you will go, I have a copy on my shelf, right? Like if you were in a Zoom conference with me, probably was in the back of your bookcase or whatever. And this was like really groundbreaking in 2018, right? It feels kind of passé even now. But this is kind of where we were pre-uprisings of this summer. We were really struggling as a nation to talk about race. Some of us were very well versed, many of us really afraid, right? And I would say it took me a long time to even say the word white, I remember 10 years ago, I was like, oh my gosh, right? You have to really practice. And Robin DiAngelo talks about this idea that we need to, in our own ways, develop our own quote unquote racial stamina, right? And to be able to talk about some of the challenges that we may face as BIPOC, or that we may see our colleagues face as BIPOC. And how to be an anti-racist is kind of like hot fire, right? And it was really spoke to the moment of our country. Ibram Kendi, ex-Kendi, who's now at BU, and I hope to eventually meet him one day, has spoken very eloquently about this idea of being anti-racist, of acting in anti-racist ways. Not just non-racist ways, but anti-racist ways. Right? So Dr. Jones, who is a public health and family practitioner, she has a wonderful way of talking about racism, right? Because one of the challenges and why people find it very difficult to talk about racism is that they worry that they'll be implicated and then they'll be a bad person, right? If I'm racist or I say the wrong thing, I'll be implicated as racist and then I'll be a bad person. So I don't want to talk about it at all. And actually, Dr. Jones, first of all, defines racism as a system, right? Sort of these structures that Dr. Shipp talked about. That structures opportunities and assigns value based on our color of our skin, or color of our skin. So the social interpretation of how one looks, the social construct, not biological, that we call race. And clearly disadvantages some individuals and communities, while unfairly advantages others in other communities. And ultimately, by trying to maintain this inequitable, unjust system, saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. You know, you try to create and maintain the system that's very biased and discriminatory. It takes energy. And, you know, at the end of the day, it takes energy from endeavors that would ultimately benefit us all. This definition of racism as a system rather than an individual character flaw, rather than a personal moral failing or psychiatric illness, helps to start conversations, because we're not trying to divide the room into you're racist, you're not racist, right? Just take that out of the equation, right? This is a system. We're all part of it. We're all fish in this water that we have been swimming in. It's racist. And by acknowledging that racism saps the strength of the whole society, we recognize that we all have skin in the game, right? To dismantle the system and to put into its place a system in which all people can know and develop their full potentials. So everyone has skin in the game, right? Doesn't matter what your skin color is, we all do. In contrast, Dr. Kendi would say that anti-racism is a powerful collection of racist, I can't see through here, anti-racist policies leading to racial equity and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas. And what is an anti-racist idea anyway? It's an idea that suggests that racial groups are equals in all their differences. There's nothing right or wrong with any racial group. While racism, right? Powerful collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity and are substantiated by racist ideas. Okay? So I haven't made this connection in my mind, and I think it would be too strong a one-to-one correlation, but I think that cultural competency, although very well-intentioned, would be kind of like, it's definitely not anti-racist. It's definitely not racist. It's kind of that non-racist, right? It's like not quite, strong enough. At the time, cultural competence sounded really great, right? And if you read this definition, you're like, yeah, what's wrong with this? It's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals and enable that system, agency, or professions to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. Oh, that sounds pretty good, right? You're like, well, what's wrong with that, Nhi-Ha? What's wrong with that? The challenge is the way that cultural competency in the early 2000s was really operationalized, right? Cultural competency ended up being focused on the knowledge, not the attitude. So for instance, you know, when I was a student, back when there used to be bookstores, I went to the medical school bookstore, and I got this great, I looked through this great book about caring for patients of different racial ethnic groups. Each chapter was very well kind of list of what different groups liked to eat in the hospital, like to have in terms of, you know, mental health or health practices, et cetera, et cetera. You can already see where I'm going with this, right? So well-intentioned. Clearly people wanted to impart the knowledge and things that they had learned about different groups and share that with their fellow clinicians and colleagues to say, okay, well, maybe we'll, you know, be able to take better care of our Vietnamese patients or Black patients because we have this little chapter. What's the challenge of that, right? So, you know, being Vietnamese, I looked at the Vietnamese chapter and I thought, oh, you know, after, say, a surgical procedure where, you know, someone has been NPO and you're introducing them food, please introduce to them rice porridge, right? And I like me a rice porridge, but I thought to myself, ooh, if I had an appendectomy and I had not eaten for 5 days, I would not be asking for rice porridge. I would be asking for, like, you know, a cheeseburger, give me some fries, something with more. I mean, that's my comfort food, right? And so it's sort of a trivial example, but it's to say that, you know, of course, you can't characterize an ethnic group or a racial group in a little chapter, right? We're much more complicated than that, and we're much more individual than that, right? And so the knowledge versus the attitude. Clearly, this kind of approach could lead to stereotyping and can ignore those power dynamics between the clinician and the patient. I remember as a medical student, you know, one of my preceptors tried to tell me, oh, you know, Nhi-Ha, isn't that Chinese for how are you? And I said, no, it's not. And, you know, I said, it's Vietnamese and this is what it means. He disagreed with me. He was like, oh, no. Actually, no, this is what it means. And I remember being a medical student feeling like, oh, I don't know if I can speak up to my preceptor, even though that was my name, right? And so I ignore sometimes this sort of a little knowledge kind of is a little dangerous. It's the same idea, right? And so I felt like I couldn't speak up because this is my doctor, my preceptor. Imagine if I were a patient and I had a PCP or a psychiatrist tell me what my name meant. I probably would say, okay, see you later. I don't know if I will stick with this guy. And as a result, can other people, right? So people can feel more marginalized and less understood, even though clearly the intention is to create more understanding between the clinician and the patient. So Dr. Gerald Wing Su in 1994 was like, ooh, cultural competence, you know, gotta love it, but we need something better. We need something more. And he said, what do we need? He said a more nuanced perspective, one that includes a focus on multiple intersecting identities, acknowledgement of the interpersonal within the individual, interpersonal and societal, thinking about those social determinants of health, influences on the lives of our patients, right? And so he was calling for something more. He didn't realize what he was calling for yet. But Drs. Tervalon and Murray Garcia at Children's Oakland also took this to heart in the late 90s and said, you know, cultural competence in medical education, we need more. We need something that's more humble. We need cultural humility. And cultural humility expands on this idea of cultural competence, right, which is very well-intentioned but still lacking. And it's defined as the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is open in relation to aspects of cultural identity most important to the patient, right? So it's very patient focused. Attitude-based, not knowledge-based. It's focused on respect and a lack of superiority with regard to the patient's culture. And it endeavors to minimize those power balances and maintain a patient focus. So for you, this is a shout out for you clinicians out there. How can I engage in cultural humility? in my practice, right? And so the DSM-5, I will say, is a real upgrade from the DSM-4, and includes not only this outline for cultural formulation, which was in the way back in the appendix in the DSM-4, but also provides an interview, the cultural formulation interview, to assist clinicians to thinking about how they might inquire, how might they engage in a culturally humble approach in talking with their patients. So this is the outline for cultural formulation. I alluded to it in the DSM-4, in the way back, in the appendix, along with those cabinet of curiosities, those, gosh, I blocked out the names of them, you know, like the cultural syndromes. And it really sent a message, right? Like, talk about marginalizing, wasn't even in the main text, it was in the appendix. And although great, a lot of clinicians were like, how do we use this? How do we use this cultural formulation? How are we going to use it day to day? So these limitations, even though people liked the idea of a cultural formulation, the DSM-5, they tried to make it more concrete, to operationalize the outline. And they also said, you know what? It's not if someone looks a little different from you or they look like a little bit like a minority. Let's use this at the beginning of your initial evaluation. You could certainly kind of space it out and use it with all your patients, because everybody has a culture, right? That sort of starts with the I. Everybody does. You know, I remember one of the first years I led this, one of my residents was like, oh, it's so good to hear everybody else's stories because mine is so boring. I'm so white. And I was like, that's not boring. That's a lot going on there, lady. So, you know, we all have a culture, right? Some of us may have not had an opportunity to examine it as much, but we all do. And rather than that risk of stereotyping, we want to take a person-centered approach. We want to be collaborative in our shared decision-making. All right, so A through D in that outline, I'll talk to you about how it translates into the cultural formulation interview. So it has 16 questions and it's available online. So, you know, if you're multitasking, you can look at it, look for it now in a PDF or later after the talk. And it really talks about, you know, what do patients, the patient in front of you, see as the definition of their problem, the cause, context, and support that they see in their lives, how they've been able to cope or seek help. And then how do they even see your relationship with them, right? What are their preferences? How do they see and expect things from your relationship with them? What's really nice is it includes questions that you can talk with the patient about. And it also has questions that you can use when you're talking with patients' families or their communities. And there are also these lots of questions, supplemental modules, thinking about different populations or subgroups or different particular situations that you might be thinking about. So it's pretty exhaustive. The reason why I bring this up is that a lot of people, when they talk with me about the sort of idea of cultural humility, they get kind of, these are seasoned clinicians, right? Like these are people who talk to patients all day long, talk to clients all day long. Okay, well, why don't you talk to your patient about their cultural background? And suddenly they get all tongue-tied, like, I don't know what to ask. I'm like, really? So this kind of gives you like a little cheat sheet. This is a way to kind of test it out, think about different ways. You know, obviously you think about ways that would feel most comfortable in your practice, but it gives you examples of how to ask some of these questions if you have not had much fluency in your own practice. All right. At the end of the day, we don't want to be navel gazing. We want to take this information and we want to make it useful. So we want to bring it all together for overall cultural assessment or diagnosis and care, right? And so this is taken from the DSM-5. Of course, you want to summarize the cultural formulation, think about how that might impact the diagnosis. And this is another thing about the DSM-5. It acknowledges from the get-go the primacy of cultural idioms of distress and how each patient really translates in their own mind, given their own perspective, the way they see their own challenges in their life, right? And we also want to think about how we might be able to create a treatment plan with our patients, right? Not just the process, so negotiating and managing a treatment plan, but also the kind of content, the kind of treatments that would be amenable to the person sitting in front of you. Whether it be biological treatments, I do have a small clinic where I see patients for medication management. So that is my training. I do think about medications. And I put this alternative therapies in quotes because we might think they're alternative because many of us may have gone to medical school, but they're not alternative to our patients. This is probably more mainstream to them than some of the biological medications that we're suggesting. What are psychological treatments that might be helpful to them? Individual, group, manualized, other kinds of treatments. And then also, given the context in which our patients live, what are other ways that we can provide patient support through their family, their community, and through their spiritual and religious practices? All right, so that's for the clinicians out there. You're thinking, gosh, Nhi-Ha, you're just talking in those crazy concepts. What can I do day to day? That's one really concrete step. So how do we become us, right? In my remaining 10 minutes. So what can we do to reduce inequities in mental health? I would say there's so much to do that for each of you, if you're interested in this, interested in taking a stand or being engaged, you decide for yourself how you want to be engaged. I sort of alluded to the fact that in my prior life, I was a researcher and I focused on disparities in mental health. I realized that my passion actually was more in the clinician and educational realm. And so since then, I've been engaged in teaching trainees at our institution and guiding them, helping them think about these issues. And I realized in teaching the students or teaching the trainees that actually our faculty could use some development as well. And so the last 5 years, we've been engaged more in thinking about how do we give faculty the same kind of language and skills that we are giving our trainees. A few years ago, we engaged in an online training effort that feels so, what's the word to use, nostalgic, right? Like, oh, this is innovative that we're doing it all online. Now it's a necessity, right? And we realized that that's a great way to reach people, no matter where they are or what they're doing. But we found that people really needed help. Our faculty, our clinical supervisors really needed help. And we're going to continue to engage in these kinds of workshops for faculty. I've sort of touched on this idea of clinical practice that each of you can take into your next encounters with patients. And for those researchers out there, there are lots of ways in which you can engage in developing an anti-racist lab or in the advocacy realm, engaging with your communities. Now, one effort that I'm engaged in right now with our department, I sort of alluded to the hospital. Our hospital has a 10-point structural equity plan. They're really thinking about this idea of policy. As Dr. Kennedy said, to be anti-racist isn't just your beliefs. It's like, how do you translate those beliefs into action? And so that requires us to look at our structures in our communities, right? So right now we're engaging in a process with a task force to develop an anti-racist strategy. And this is from the request of the chair of our department and leadership to really engage leaders in the department around these areas. So of course, we're looking at the clinical sphere, the research sphere, pipeline, right, is a big one, not just for trainees, not just for faculty, but for staff, everyone at any level and at every corner of our department. How do we think about the policies, not just written policies, but unwritten policies, right? The way you do things, the culture of our department. And how do we think about how do we report challenges with a bias, et cetera, in our department. And ultimately, we're interested in education, training, and culture change. And so how do we do that? With an eye, of course, on how we engage the communities that we serve in all of these efforts. So becoming us, cultural humility is lifelong work, right? And so I don't know if I emphasized this enough at the beginning, but just as a journey through all this work, I encourage you all to start on your personal journey. Yeah, and we're different at different stages, each of us. when you talk with your friends or colleagues, you'll see, oh, they're at this place in their thinking. And we all evolve and grow, we hope, and find meaning in our growth as well. So let's start from the I, our own self-assessment about your cultural identity, your values, your prejudices and biases. We want to be humble about the limits of our own knowledge, skills, treatment, and assessment. You all are sitting here today or listening to me because you do value diversity by an awareness of and a sensitivity to cultural differences. We want to be vigilant toward the power dynamics that can result from cultural differences. And ultimately, we want to be responsive to those cultural differences by adaptation of our assessment and our treatment practices. Similarly, anti-racism is also lifelong work, right? And so that requires us to be sort of consciously deciding every day to make choices that are equitable, right? And they require ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection as we move through life. In the absence of making those choices, we can sometimes unconsciously uphold aspects of white supremacy and equals institutions in society. But ultimately, being racist or anti-racist is not about who you are, it's about what you do. Now, I put in here, I kind of snuck in this term, white supremacy, right? And I grew up in the South, so to me, white supremacy is like the KKK, it's guys in white robes, really toxic stuff. What we're talking about here in terms of white supremacy is that sort of upholding of the hierarchy, right? Of racism based on skin color. So these are some of the unconscious cultural attitudes and norms that we might have in our country that we may not even realize that put, white Americans at the top and value them at the top. All right. One of my last slides, Becoming Us, anti-racism is lifelong work. A lot of you might have started this and started hearing me speak in that kind of fear zone, like, ooh, what's she talking about? And do I want to spend my lunchtime on a Thursday hearing about this? I hope that you stuck with me and that you're finding yourself in the learning zone, like thinking about and reflecting on your place in all of this. And just to say, none of us chose this, but it just means that we are here, right? And so since we're here, we gotta, keep going. We gotta keep growing and keep learning. So sort of full circle, if you want to start from the I, this is my latest read, and actually at 1:30, I'll be joining a book club that we started in our Center for Diversity for the tome Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. And this is a wonderful book. It's a challenging book, but it really does go through all of these concepts in much greater detail and challenges the reader to really engage with the material, not just as they, but I. So in sum, and then I'll stop sharing my screen and hope to talk with you all today in more of a dialogue. I hope that you've I've impressed on you that I've been trying to come from the I. I hope that you will also come from the I. And think about this as a lifelong process of self-reflection. Then, eventually, after you've reflected, that you'll progress to we. You all on this call, translating your values and goals into action in your department, outside of the department, in your communities, with the goal ultimately of becoming us. And, I definitely grew up in the time of thinking about the golden rule, right? Treat others as you would like to be treated. Excuse me, I almost gave up away the answer there. But really, I heard from a D&I expert that we really should be thinking about the platinum rule. And, my kids are at home with me. You might hear a few dishes in the background because my spouse is on lunch lady duty. But, recently my school-age daughter said, Mama, what do you mean treat others the way you want to be treated? We should be treating others the way they want to be treated. And I was like, exactly. And that might feel very elemental and basic, right? Like, oh yeah, we should treat others the way they want to be treated. But I would say that similar to doing things the shortcut way, we may forget that. And so I'm asking us, I'm challenging us, challenge myself every day to take an intentional framework to think about the person in front of you, the empathy that we might be able to share with communities that we serve. Thank you so much. I'm a newbie when it comes to WebEx, so I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen here. There you go. And see your bright and shiny faces. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you so much for that great talk. I really got a lot out of it, and I hope everyone else did too. I do have to run to another meeting soon, but I just want to thank you so much. I also had one quick question. First of all, someone asked if you could share your slides, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
You can send it to me, and I'll make sure it's distributed.
Of course, I will send them to you, Crystal. I'll probably put them in a PDF format if that's okay.
That would be perfect. And I also wondered, if patients feel uncomfortable bringing up race or culture on their own, do you bring it up most of the time with patients, and how does that usually go?
Ooh, just start with an easy question, Crystal. Just joking. So I would say I do try to talk about it. I have patients, especially now with the racial uprisings of this year, will bring it up spontaneously because everybody is affected in some way. But I do try to engage in this idea of what's your cultural identity? How would you self-identify racially or ethnically from the get-go, as part of my evaluation. And then just as you all do, I try to listen for those kinds of undercurrents, because they do come in when people are talking about what's going on, especially now with everything so charged. So I try to make it part of the conversation, just as, I don't think it's the same intimacy, but I think you're sort of highlighting that for some people it might feel very sensitive. So think about when you were a medical student, first took a sexual history, though it feels very intimate, right? So our personal identities. But I think the more we talk about it, the more we give voice to it, we signal to our patients and our clients that it's okay to talk about. It's something that we welcome into the room. I think it's a little easier for me because people will say, oh, well, I do have a lot of Vietnamese and Asian American patients, so they come to me because they're looking for someone that they think might be able to understand them based on a shared history, but doesn't matter. I think that you could signal to your patients in different ways that you're open to talking about anything.
Thank you so much. And I really like the point of, going from being culturally competent, which does have a very kind of paternalistic tone of like, I know how to do this, to a much more humble position where it's like, why don't you tell me your story? And I found that just really valuable. So like I said, I have to run in a few minutes. I'm going to pass on managing the chat to my colleague, Danae. But thank you so much, and that was a great lecture.
Oh, thanks so much, Crystal. Thank you again for the invitation. Hope to talk to you offline as well about how things are going for you in the fellowship.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal, for bringing Nhi-Ha to us. I'll take a look at the chat and ask any questions, but if people just want to speak up and ask questions, so far, most of the comments are about what a great lecture this was. That was excellent.
Oh, very kind.
And asking for your slides. So,
yes.
Several people were interested in that. But any other questions, I'm happy to read them if people just want to shout them out.
Yeah, feel free to speak up as well.
Andrea Thompson would like to.
Because the same thing, I guess, is based along the lines as Crystal was saying, but not for the patient, but for colleagues. Mm-hmm. How do you engage in this conversation at times when it appears to be uncomfortable for coworkers?
Yes. Is there Andre, is there a situation you're thinking about, or just more general?
Let's just keep it at general right now.
Okay, all right, okay. I respect that. I hear you. I would say that it's even harder sometimes to talk to our colleagues, right? Because we're in the workplace and, we kind of want to keep it light. Sometimes we worry about giving offense or being offended ourselves. I definitely have been in both of those shoes. Sometimes I would just lend voice to the discomfort. You know, just speak to the discomfort. Like I was talking to one of the APA fellows that I mentor, and he identifies as a white man. And he's become a part of a larger effort with his co-residents focusing on anti-racism, which I think is wonderful, right? But he also expressed at the time discomfort, right? Like, here I am, a white man. Why am I the one leading this group? I don't want to be the one doing all this work. But at the same time, I want to be, you know, I don't love this term, but ally, or, you know, I want to be a co-conspirator. I want to be there supporting. And I said, well, why don't you just say, I just lend voice to that. Like, I just want to say, I feel a little bit uncomfortable here, and speak from the eye.
Okay.
Speak from the eye.
So when you say that, the second one would be then how do, you know, because I do at times I feel uncomfortable myself, you know, and
Yes.
especially as a Black man and normally in a room that is majority white. And
Yes.
So what would I need to do? Because sometimes I feel that I need to do something to make everyone else feel more comfortable without, it's always the, when I'm trying to express an opinion, I feel more like I wish you just hurry up and get it done and over. And some things I say may make other people uncomfortable, but sometimes I feel if we challenge, then we have open debate. How can I do that in a way that doesn't make someone else feel uncomfortable because I am Black and I'm a male, but just really wanting to share and exchange and dialogue and information?
I think just saying that, you know, just starting from the eye, because I will often say, look, I'm uncomfortable here. The discomfort sometimes is that growth edge for both sides, right? Sort of your being able to express yourself in a way while not worrying if you're making your white colleagues uncomfortable, right? Like, that's on them. If they're a little uncomfortable, I would just challenge to say that that's their growth edge, you know? But you're, you know, obviously you're responsible for yourself and how you want to present yourself, but you should not feel responsible for how they take it. That's their growth edge, is what I'm trying to say. Maybe I'm being a little challenging here, controversial. But just to say, look, you know, I want to share something in the spirit of open dialogue. You know, this is who I am, and as a Black man, you may feel a particular way, but I feel it's important because I value our relationship for you to hear what I have to say. You know, something like that. You know, you would be able to say it in a way that would feel like it resonates with you. But that's the kind of thing I often will say.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course. Thank you for speaking up. I love your hat collection in the background too. What a great placement for it, just for right when you head out the door.
Yep. Mirror hat. Let's go.
Perfect. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And absolutely, that is really on your white colleagues to take on the discomfort and looking, you know, being able to look at themselves. Like Nhi-Ha mentioned, examining, doing our self-assessments, and then looking at whiteness as a culture. We don't often consider our dominant culture to be the culture, but whiteness is very much its own culture. And we got a few other people here. Someone mentioned power dynamics in the workplace are real too, and can add another level to that discomfort. And you mentioned that too in your talk about, you know, being a medical student and having to challenge attending about your own name. So I don't know necessarily if that's a question, but certainly I think that's something that we struggle with a lot. I'm just going to try to mute this person if I can.
Okay.
Actually, I'm not able to. So.
What do I call it? What's that?
Just a shout out. I do this myself, but if y'all can mute yourself, sometimes I rush into a meeting and forget to mute myself. And
thank you. I don't
know in the background
of the meeting, but if someone's able to mute them, they're on the phone, so I don't know if they'll hear us.
I know they might be engrossed. No worries. I get it. I've definitely been that person. Power dynamics are real. I don't want to misstate that. I mean, I feel it too You know, I was telling this story to a colleague of mine. We were on like a holiday Zoom call with the students, and one of the deans was kind of waxing poetic, going way over time on a Friday night when everybody wanted to go do their own thing. And I sat there and I remember thinking, why am I not speaking up? This is clearly past time. We got to go. And so I bring up that small example to say, like, I'm not trying to minimize, you know, it takes a lot to sort of speak up and speak out. What I would suggest is, you know, if each of us ends up, and I end up in that kind of situation a lot where I'm uncomfortable, I want to say something, I'm not sure. Andre's comment of like, I don't know how to say that, and should I say that, you know, then find someone who you feel is like a trusted colleague or coworker to kind of think through it. Right? Would be the positives, negatives of speaking up or speaking out. You know, unless it's fire and you got to run right away, you can take a pause and come back to whatever the situation is at hand. And sometimes when I'm a little bit more my wise mind rather than my emotional mind, I can react in a better way. So sometimes that's what I would suggest. If I feel uneasy, kind of listen to that limbic sense, listen to that reptilian brain. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? Take a pause, think through it. How might I want to engage or in that conflict, maybe with someone who's a superior or not, and then realize I can always come back. So that's what I would, that's my rule of thumb. That's the way I try to live life, mainly because I'm a hothead. And so I know that if I speak in the moment, I'll probably say something very inappropriate, but just it has served me well in those situations. I see
Hi,
lots
Will
in the chat.
Carpenter.
Oh, yes,
Yep.
hi.
So this is enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you very
question.
much.
Harvard has a series of tests on things like race and gender that rely on the speed of response. In terms of, so you can expose yourself to your own biases. Are they useful in the processes that you're talking about?
Absolutely. So I think you're referring to the implicit association test, the IAT.
Yes.
And it's just for a shout out there for everyone on the call. You can Google it. It is free of charge. I heard recently Professor Benaji, who did the groundbreaking work on this test, talk about that. I think it's really important. There's some very nice papers where they looked at clinicians, cardiologists in this case, and had people take the IAT. And, you know, it basically, as you're alluding to, it kind of pairs identities with certain characteristics, right? And so, for instance, I'll take my identity. It'll have like American, white, foreign, Asian, right? And so you'll kind of go through this little test and it'll kind of switch things up on you, right? And so you'll find that it takes your brain a little bit longer to kind of, you know, what's the word to use, to dampen down that initial association, right? And so depending on how quickly you answer the questions, you can kind of see what your automatic associations are, right? That's not, again, to say that if I found initially when I took this test, when I first learned of the IET, I was biased against myself. I thought Asians were more foreign, even though I've lived most of my life in the US and I have a US citizen. So it's interesting because it kind of probes these sort of automatic associations. And there have been really interesting papers that have been able to elucidate that even though consciously we may hold values of equity, of anti-racist values, that just by being socialized into this culture, that we have certain associations that start from when we're very young, toddlers, you know, kids will grab the white doll over the black doll from age 2, 3, right? So this is the society we live in. It kind of probes for you personally. There's some really nice data that they've gathered through the decades based on this. So I encourage you to check it out. It has different categories, not just on race, but body size, in terms of religious or spiritual preference, sexual preference. What was interesting was that Dr. Benaji, she's done this for so long that she's been able to demonstrate, for instance, in terms of sexual orientation, those norms and values, people have become more progressive over time. And she thought that was actually really encouraging, right? Because there is this kind of culture shift and generational shift over time that has made certain biases that we may hold as a society less fixed, more pliable. So that's positive news. We still have a ways to go, clearly. But I encourage you to check it out. That's oh, thank you, Sharon Hoover. Just put that in the chat. Check it out for yourselves. It's very interesting. I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Can you ask your question? Okay.
Yeah, no, hi, this is Sharon Hoover, and thank you so much. That was an excellent talk, and I put a really long-winded question into the chat box. But, I'll just say it. We're a national center that provides TA and training to schools and behavioral health leaders. One of the pillars of our work is cultural responsiveness and equity, and we're increasingly including topics of anti-racism and cultural humility in the training, but not surprisingly have noticed that it shuts down some communities seemingly, or at least some participants, especially, frankly, those that are predominantly white or politically conservative. And, you know, this past year, the federal government fueled this stance in several ways, but including a ban on racial sensitivity training for federal contractors, and we are a federal contractor. So, you know, we're trying to walk this balance in some ways of meeting communities where they are, so they're more likely to be open to or engage in personal and system change. However, if we leave terms or topics out to meet communities where we are, we feel like we're really outside of our value system and maybe contributing to oppression. So what suggestions do you have for less receptive groups to do kind of this system level training?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I hope that some things may change with 2021, and some of those sort of executive orders that have been really stressful for federal contractors like yourselves may be overturned. So, you know, help, you know, that may, you know, this question may be moot, that part of it. I know that for private institutions, we've grappled with that and have decided, well, we're just going to move forward. We're just going to move forward. I mean, that's different for if you have a federal contract. Yeah. As far as the second question, that's a harder question, and I struggle with that personally. So, for instance, the talk I gave here, I sort of assumed, I had certain assumptions about the culture that I was going to walk into, although I don't know you all very well. But I've definitely been part of trainings and diversity dialogues where we might already know that people are of a particular framework or haven't examined their own identities or examined some of these words or skills or concepts. And I would just start there. Sort of the more inquisitive, you know, starting from the 101 or even pre-101 stage, right? And try to understand the reluctance and the barriers to understanding this. And maybe there isn't an understanding that structural racism exists. I mean, that is definitely a topic right now in our country, is that there are many people who don't see racism as an issue. In which case, you know, I'm going to attend a training where they talk about this idea of racism as a structure, and how, and to Dr. Jones's point, like how it actually impacts all of us, right? And so this particular training talks about how health outcomes, for instance, in the US is very far behind, you know, our colleague countries, the similar sort of SES and industrialized level. And that's because of the structures of racism, right? That we've been held back. We've all been sapped because of this focus on racism. But that's one way of doing it. But I think that you understand your groups much more. You understand your participants and who they are, and trying to meet them where they are, right? And maybe taking those baby steps. It's gonna be frustrating. It's often very frustrating in these sort of groups where there are people at different places of their journey to engage those people. But that's kind of where we are, I think. That's kind of where we are. I hope that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you for this question.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for the work you do. I apologize. I've lost track of the chat, so.
I'm watching it for you. We do have.
Okay, thank you.
There. Yeah, absolutely. You're doing a lot of hard work, so I'll carry this one for you.
Oh, thanks.
Someone asked, you mentioned that you don't like the term ally. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I have a mixed feeling about the term ally, right? It sounds great. Like, I think it sounds great. Like, I'm an ally, but, Layla Saad talks about this idea of optical or performative allyship, right? And so we saw that a lot this summer. Like, suddenly, the purveyor of my favorite yoga pants was displaying Black Lives Matter, right? And we know yoga in the US is not people like me. It's usually very svelte, tall, lovely white women. That's kind of like the yoga demographic. And I was like, really? I think about my yoga studio, like, if Black lives didn't matter, we'd look a little different in here. And so I think the challenge is that allyship is well-intentioned. Of course, we want to be an ally. We want to work towards justice and work against oppression. But it has gotten to the point where it's a little passive. And so I often look to thinkers in this field, and I don't know if I have a better term at this point, so I use it with sort of a grain of salt, but some people have suggested, co-conspirator, something more active, right? Something that signals that we each are working in our small ways, day to day, in baby steps to work toward change, not just although those are important, the symbols and the signs, but more action-oriented terms. So that's just my take. I also use the word all the time, but I also critique it as well, because it's more of like this idea of like, well, what am I doing really? Am I just saying, or am I doing? So that's my take on that.
Thank you. And Dr. Forrester shared a link to an article on the dangers of performative allyship that everyone should take a look at.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you from the question asker, Tiffany Beeson. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tiffany, for asking the question.
So I don't see any other questions that haven't been answered in the chat. Does anyone have anything they would like to ask? Oh, wait, sorry, we just got a new one. Question about structural racism in education. My kids attend Baltimore City Public Schools, which have some wonderful, hardworking teachers and kids, but have buildings that lack heat and AC, out-of-date books, few supplies. That's all I see. Go ahead.
That was mine, and I'm a lousy typist, so I hit go before I finished the question. I guess my question is, lots of people didn't get the fair start, right? So yes. They may not have progressed as well. We know that, say, like African American children are like more likely to like fail classes or be suspended from school or things like that. And my kids go to school. Most of the city is African American, and I think the general the kids are poor, and because they're Black, I think it's sometimes easy for the folks who fund it to give them less. And dripping ceilings or broken chemistry sets and like whatever that wouldn't be tolerated in wealthier school districts are seen to be like acceptable or adequate because these kids are not as important, right? Mm-hmm. So, and sometimes I feel like the kids are not held to as high a standard either. Mm-hmm. And they think that they're taking advanced whatever, but actually kids are getting a better education other places. So how do we like hit that balance? Like acknowledging that the starting line wasn't fair, but also not like dumbing down standards and like saying to kids, you can't achieve, or just passing them along because we feel sorry for them, as opposed to really, we have to work to make it right to get them the right opportunity, but the outcome isn't always going to be the same. Sorry, that was inelegantly said. And
yes, I apologize. I think you cut in and out a little bit there, but I think your question is a good one, is sort of how do we address the structural racism that exists in schools, and how do we sort of create a climate, an environment, an expectation of equity, right? So giving kids what they need to succeed. That's what I heard. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Well, first of all, I think that, in your kids' schools, I would be that advocate to say like, hey, this is not acceptable. These kids deserve more. Doesn't matter where they come from, the color of their skin, they deserve equity. And that means more resources to bring justice, right? I think about for my kids, they go to public schools here. I remember when our kids when I was pregnant, and people were like, oh, in Boston, they're the Boston suburbs, right? And very affluent, very white. And, there was always this question like, oh, Nhi-Ha, are you going to send your kids, are you going to move to the suburbs to send your kids to the good schools? And I knew what that meant. That was sort of subtext of like white, right? Because it was affluent suburbs. And for me personally, given the work I do, I really thought about the fact that, my kids actually will gain more from being in this kind of diverse, multicultural environment, and by being there. And, it's sort of a win-win. There's a lot of evidence that, both sides of the equation in these more integrated schools, people who might have a higher SES versus lower SES, white kids versus Black kids or Latinx kids from all environments actually ultimately benefit when it's more integrated. So, it's one of those things where, we're fortunate in that our kids go to schools where there is a focus on social justice and on equity, right? And so this idea of trying to give kids the resources that they need to succeed, no matter where their starting point might be coming from. So to me personally, that's aligned with my values clearly. But I think by participating and by being in that conversation and being a part of that community, both sides gain. So as a parent, I would suggest that you be that squeaky wheel. Say, I will not stand for this. We want equity for our kids, no matter what their background in that school. So, you could be part of that change.
Thank you. We do have another question from Elaine Wiener. How do you apply these concepts to a busy ER or clinic situation with mostly white staff dealing with mostly minority patient populations?
Yes, that's a very good question. I would say that's where the pedal hits the metal, right? So I'm an outpatient psychiatrist. I've been so since residency. And so I have, in many ways, a more relaxed way of thinking about things, right? Because I have the luxury of time, right? Unless it's a safety situation, I can address these concepts and these issues over time. But I think that the question here is, what if you don't have that time? Well, we might not be able to do a soup to nuts cultural formulation, but I think using your clinical judgment to focus in on whether it be the specific, explanatory model of illness that might be impacting the patient getting care, or the specific structural issues that might be impacting the patient and causing them stress, being more focused that way. For the, and this is often the case, this is definitely the case at Mass General, where it's a majority white population taking care of racial and ethnic minorities, sort of taking a step back and trying to engage the leadership of that particular milieu and saying, hey, I think we need some, continuing education, some faculty development around this. On our inpatient units, we've done a series of workshops with and it's a multidisciplinary team, right? So you've got OT, PT, chaplaincy, nurses, physicians, psychologists, residents, and we've done it virtually. This really nice workshop where we talk about how do we address bias at the bedside. And we do role plays and talk about these things and talk about specific case scenarios that might come up in this situation in the inpatient psychiatric unit. So I would say, that takes a longer, again, I sort of put in that piece about strategic planning. because unfortunately Rome won't be built in a day, that, you as the individual clinician, you can take these concepts, but if you want to make lasting change with your clinical environment, that requires some, getting stakeholders and leadership involved and thinking about a longer term educational cultural shift for everybody on your team. I see some nice sharing of resources.
I want to thank you, Nhi-Ha, for coming. I am Anique Forrester, and I am the chair of the department's diversity committee. And
yes,
exactly what you've described is what we're doing. We're sort of taking the long haul approach. And to the credit of our leadership, we have some really engaged leaders in our department, including our chair, Dr. Rock Beisel, who's really set the standard that this is something that we will engage in. We'll do the hard work, the slow work, because there aren't any quick fixes. And yes. I think that this has just been tremendous that you've come to us and really sort of highlighted some of the things that we've already been talking about, but also given us new perspectives. So I really appreciate you and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Forrester. I would love to hear from you and learn from your group and how you guys are tackling this, because I would say we're still taking baby steps. I'm not trying to oversell what we're doing. We're working hard, but we have a lot of work to do.
Absolutely, and I'll be in contact with you after this. So maybe
I would love to meet up.
Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I know that it's almost 1:30, and when I leave meetings, I'm a guest here, so y'all do what you want to do. But I've been leaving a few minutes so that people could take their bio breaks or stretch or get a cup of coffee or that kind of thing. But I do want to leave a minute or two for any closing burning questions. Otherwise, y'all can always reach out to me after this.
I don't see anything else in the chat right now, and I do just really want to thank you again. There's been a lot of thank yous and comments on the exceptional nature of your presentation today, and I think you've highlighted a lot of things for us, ways that we can do a better job with this, ways we need to look at ourselves, work to build a we and an us. And I think some of the questions today also highlighted that our colleagues need us to do this work and our patients need us to do this work. And so I hope everyone here today heard that message and is willing and ready to engage. Join the diversity committee if you want to learn more and do more of this work. But thank you again so much. This was incredible. We really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I've learned so much from you all. It actually gives me faith and hope in humanity. Sometimes, especially in my little home office, I think, oh my gosh, there's so much work to do. And here we are doing it alone. But it's wonderful to hear that you all in Baltimore are engaging in these efforts. And it's like a long fight. It's like the ultra marathon and a desert kind of thing. So while you're doing this work, definitely nourish each other. It sounds like you're creating that kind of community. So. All right, well, have a wonderful, wonderful and safe, healthy holiday season. Best wishes. And yes, please keep in touch. I think that Crystal and Liz, who organized the Grand Rounds, has my email. Let me see if I can just chat it here. Let me just give it to you here. Please give me a shout out. I would love to hear more from you all. I will send Crystal a PDF of my slides and so hope to see you on the flip side in 2021. Take good care.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.